Yes, would you ask Mr. Sakula to come back in, please? Right, Mr. Sakula, ready to carry on?
Yes, thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes, that's great.
Yes, great. Yes, good afternoon, Mr. Sakula. I just want to return to one passage in the transcript this morning, just to check one of your answers. If we can go to page 105, lines 10 to 16, I was asking you a series of questions about whether a cladding contractor would take comfort from the fact that they'd used a material like ACM for many years on many buildings, and that those materials were manufactured by ostensibly reputable companies. And if we look at 10 to 16, I said, in your view, do these considerations in any way lessen the need for the reasonably competent cladding contractor to conduct rigorous and exhaustive compliance checks each time they use the products? Is that what you would expect of the reasonably competent cladding contractor? And you answered yes. I just want to be clear on your answer. Are you answering yes because you're answering, it's my fault for the poor way I've put the question, that you would expect the reasonably competent cladding contractor to conduct rigorous and exhaustive compliance checks each time they use the product? Is that right?
Could I just read this? Please?
Yes, of
Again,
course. I'm so sorry.
Reread this. I just want to... Yes, I'm saying yes to the question, would those considerations lessen the need for them to conduct rigorous and exhaustive compliance checks?
So you think that you wouldn't need to conduct such rigorous and exhaustive checks if you've used the products for many years on many buildings? Is that what you're saying?
No, I don't think I'm saying that.
Yes, because I thought you were saying the opposite of that you would still need to conduct rigorous checks and compliance checks, even if you've used the materials.
That's what I intended to say.
Great, yes.
Yes, that each case has to be looked at on its merits.
Yes, thank you.
So really, I think you're saying previous experience cannot be relied on for future purposes.
Yes, because every building is different.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Yes, that's helpful. Sorry, we just had a request to clarify that on the transcript. So, yes. Just moving to a short topic now, the means of disseminating knowledge within the cladding industry. If we can look at paragraph 7.2.1 on page 29 of your report. You tell us there that most companies in the construction industry subscribe to some sort of library service whereby they have online access to codes, standards and other technical information. Such services would require at least one named individual within the company who would be the main correspondent. The service would usually provide regular notifications when new documents are published. On receipt of such a notification, the correspondent would be expected to inform those within their organisation who would need to know about the new publication or update to an existing publication. Now, would you expect, therefore, the reasonably competent cladding contractor to have a system for disseminating updates to those within the organisation to whom they were applicable? For example, in relation to design, would you expect there to be a system for disseminating technical design updates to those within the organisation who were responsible for the design of cladding systems?
Yes.
Yes. Now, I'd now like you to ask you some questions about the potential role which a specialist facade engineer or specialist facade consultant could play if appointed. And just to be clear, no such specialist was appointed on the Grenfell project, either at the pre-novation stage or at the post-novation stage once Rayna were appointed as the main design and build contractor. But you very helpfully set out some history surrounding the role that a specialist facade engineer or contractor can play. And if we can start by looking at page 23 of your report. Now, at 6.1.1 and following, I'm not going to read it all out, you have explained that there was this evolution of this role of the specialist facade engineer or consultant. And you say at 6.1.1, during the 1970s and 80s, people with experience in the facade industry began to offer services as consultants, typically to building owners and architects. Initially, these were individual consultants, but by the early 1990s, the larger multidisciplinary consultancies in the UK began to recognise the value of providing facade consultancy as a new specialised service. And then you explain certain terms in 6.1.2, and picking up halfway through that paragraph, you say, like other kinds of engineering, this service, i.e. the service of facade engineer, implied a more hands-on approach involving, for example, structural and thermal calculations and detailed design and specification. This is distinct from a pure consultancy role involving, for example, the review of architects' drawings. And you tell us in 6.1.3 that you use the single term facade engineer for brevity. And at 6.1.4 and follows, you provide a little bit more about the history of how the architectural and other construction professionals have evolved. And I'm not going to read all of that out, but you talk about the evolution, for example, of building services engineers in the middle of the 20th century. And at 6.1.6, at the bottom of that page, you say, similarly, the growth of facade engineering during the last quarter of the 20th century was driven by the need for building owners and architects to receive sound technical facade advice, independent of any commercial interests. And that you say the people coming into facade engineering were from a variety of backgrounds, and if we go over the page, from the design and technical departments of facade contractors themselves, from architects with a technical bent, from product and industrial designers, from building physics specialists, and from structural engineers. And then at 6.1.9, you go on to explain that the advice given by such facade engineers reflected the increasingly complex technical nature of facades in the second half of the 20th century, and generally both building owners and architects welcome this advice at the pre-contract stages of the project. But you then explain later in that paragraph that as well as providing services at that stage, many main contractors also had the appointment of specialist facade contractors. And at 6.1.10, if we can scroll up, we can see the new service was generally welcomed by other professionals in the field as it was recognised that the facade of the building was the part that had historically given rise to the largest proportion of building problems, such as rainwater penetration, condensation, breakages, and so on. Most architects in particular saw the role of a facade engineer as helpful to them in minimising potential future liabilities with regard to the facade. So that's the background and the genesis of facade engineers. And if we look at page 25 of your report, you tell us at 6.2.3 that in 2004, the Society of Facade Engineering, the SFE, was founded jointly by the Royal Institute of British Architects, the RIBA, the Institution of Structural Engineers, and the Chartered Institution of Building Services Engineers. And you tell us at the end of that paragraph, the SFE is a growing professional society and acts as a qualifying body for facade engineers. However, there is currently no requirement in the UK for a facade engineer to be a member of the SFE in order to practice. And just to be clear, it's right, isn't it, that facade engineer and facade consultant are not protected titles by and what I mean by that is those terms are not legally restricted to use by particular persons who've completed specific training or education.
That's correct, yes.
Yes. And you note in your report that there's no current requirement for a facade engineer to be a member of the Society of Facade Engineering. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
And is it also right that there's not a minimum qualification level for any grade of membership of the SFE?
Oh, I think there probably is, yes.
I see.
Yes.
I see. Okay. If we turn now to paragraph 6.5.1 of your report on page 27, you tell us there, going back to the early 1990s, it would not have been common for a facade consultant to be appointed for an overcladding project of this type. However, it was not unheard of. And I give in paragraph 6.6 below an example. However, by 2012, in my experience, it would have been normal for a facade engineer to be appointed for any large or complex project. The overcladding of a high-rise residential tower is a large project, but it may not be complex. The situation in which a facade engineer would not be appointed for this kind of project would be where the architect had enough technical knowledge and relevant experience not to require the additional expertise, or where the building owner did not wish to pay for an additional consultant. Now, just to be clear, the example that you give, that you're referring to in 3 lines down in that paragraph, of someone, a project where a facade consultant was appointed pre-2012, was the Hackney East London project you were referring to earlier. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. And you tell us that the overcladding of a high-rise residential tower is a large project, and we touched on that earlier, but it may not be complex. Would you agree that the appointment of a facade engineer or consultant is necessary on a large or a complex cladding project?
Well, it's as I've said here, I wouldn't use the word necessary. I've been careful not to say that it has to be required. It depends on the capabilities of the architect.
Yes.
Some architects are comfortable with their technical knowledge and feel that they don't need the services of a facade engineer.
Yes.
Others welcome it and would rather have a facade engineer on board.
Yes. In terms of Grenfell Tower, was that a complex project in your opinion?
Not really, no. Not from a facade point of view.
In reaching that view, have you taken into account not simply the selection of materials, but also the geometrical challenges presented by Grenfell Tower itself? For example, the configuration of the columns and the relationship between the spandrels and the windows, for example, as highlighted by Mr. Hyatt in the presentation that he did with his physical model.
All right. I mean, it's got some geometrical complexity, but it's nothing compared with some buildings I can think of by comparison with really cutting-edge buildings. It's not especially complex in my view.
I see. So you maintain your view that Grenfell Tower was a large project, but not a particularly complex project in terms of facade design?
Yes.
Yes. And is the main consideration to be taken into account when deciding whether a facade engineer is necessary for a large project the capability of the existing professional team?
Effectively, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, in terms of the pre-novation stage, so the potential appointment of a facade consultant by the client, in this case that would be the TMO, if we look at paragraph 6.6.2 on page 27 of your report, we can see that you're asked the question, just before 6.6.2, in italics, you're asked the question, would you expect consideration to have been given to the appointment of a facade engineer or consultant to advise a local authority on a project such as the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower? If so, by whom would you expect such an appointment to have been considered? And you say at 6.6.2, in the case of the Grenfell Tower refurbishment, I would expect such an appointment to have been considered by the tenant management organisation in dialogue with Studio E during the pre-novation phase. The dialogue would have needed to address whether Studio E had the required experience and or technical expertise in overcladding a tall residential building. So that's what you told us you would have expected. So does it follow that you would have expected the client, the TMO, to have been aware of the availability of facade engineers and facade consultants as a potential resource to assist with the design and specification of the overcladding system?
I wouldn't be sure if the TMO would have been aware of it, but I'm sure that Studio E would have been aware of that possibility.
I see. So is it your opinion that the person initiating the discussion about whether a fire engineer should have been appointed should have been the architect in this case?
Probably, yes.
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 Did you mean fire engineer?
Facade engineer.
Sorry, I didn't mean fire
No,
engineer.
it's come up in the transcript.
Sorry, I meant facade engineer or facade consultant. Yes, thank you. Can we just look at Mr. Hyatt's expert report for a moment? This is at PHYR 5027, page 17. He says at 2.5.14, he says, accordingly, it's my opinion that at the time of the appointment, Studio E would rightly have considered themselves well able to undertake a project of the type, size and complexity of the Grenfell Tower refurbishment and overcladding, albeit I would expect that they should have recognised that their then current levels of knowledge and skill would need to be expanded. This could have been done by undertaking research into the discrete characteristics of the project that they were about to undertake and, if necessary, making some strategic hires. Such approaches are common amongst architects when undertaking new commissions. So, with reference to Mr. Hyatt there saying that they perhaps ought to have thought about supplementing its knowledge by making strategic hires, would you also suggest that they should have considered obtaining advice from a facade consultant or engineer?
Well, I'm not making a comment. I haven't made a comment on Studio E's capabilities. I've only said that it would have been normal to have the discussion.
Yes.
I have assessed, as part of my brief, Studio E's capability for this. So I wouldn't answer your question, yes, they should have considered it. But if they had doubts about their capability to do this, and that's a question they needed to consider themselves, then they should have considered appointing a facade engineer.
Yes, that's helpful. If we assume hypothetically that a facade engineer or consultant had been appointed at the pre-novation stage, i.e. prior to the appointment of Rayna as design and build contractor, in your experience, would such a facade engineer have had a role in selecting or specifying products for use in the facade?
Pre-contract, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. In my experience, products were rarely specified by their specific product name, but more generically, or by performance characteristics. So it's quite unusual in my experience to specify a particular product. Yeah. I mean, I have been involved in one project where we did do that. That was highly unusual. It's not normal.
Yes. Yes, that's helpful.
The point being that it's usually left to the contractor to propose a product, and then the consultant reviews its acceptability.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And would you anticipate that there would be design development meetings between the architect and any facade engineer to look at the development of the design for the facade?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Now, you've picked up in your report the fact that for the Grenfell Tower project, the structural engineer, Curtains Consulting, wrote a specification for the overcladding work, which did address more than just structural matters. If we can look at where you deal with this in your report, if we go to page 27 and look at 6.6.3, I just want to read what you've put there. You say, I note, however, that the appointed structural engineer, Curtains Consulting, wrote a specification entitled Structural Performance Specification for the Design, Supply and Application of Overcladding Systems to Grenfell Tower, dated March 2013. Section 7.0 of this document is called Overcladding and addresses more than just structural considerations. For example, whether... Let me go over the page. Weather performance and fire matters are also covered. Although not covered by my present brief, I note the following extracts, and then you've put in a couple of extracts, one where it says the system should comply with BRE 135 document, and then an extract where it says the system shall not be a fire risk at any stage of installation, nor shall it constitute a fire hazard after completion if for any reason the insulant becomes exposed. And you say in the following paragraph, I mention the above because it appears that Curtains Consulting covered both structural and non-structural issues in connection with the overcladding, and that fact may have contributed to the TMO's decision not to appoint a facade engineer. Now, in your experience, was it unusual for a structural engineer to write a specification for a facade which went beyond purely structural matters?
Yes, very unusual.
Right. So this was an unusual situation.
Yes.
In this instance. And you then go on in the next paragraph, 6.6.5, you say the issue of who would pay the fees for a facade engineer would always be a factor in the discussion. Some building owners consider that they are already paying the architect to design and specify the facade of the building, and they do not see a need to pay another consultant to do this. In cases where the building is large or of a complex nature, the architect may nevertheless convince the building owner that the appointment of a facade engineer is necessary. Now, in circumstances where the architect at the pre-novation stage did not raise the appointment of a facade engineer and did not flag any difficulty with carrying out the design, would you still have expected the client to consider the appointment of one?
No, I think it should have been considered, but if the architect satisfied the client that they had the necessary technical expertise and experience, then I can't see the client insisting on it.
Right. So you're clear that it should have been thought about and discussed at that stage?
Yes.
Yes. Now, at paragraph 9 in the summary of your report, if we can go to page 4, this is where you're summarising your opinions.
Just so, have we left that topic or?
No, I'm still
okay,
in the topic of a facade engineer pre-novation. I'm going to look at post-novation at the moment.
Okay.
So paragraph 9 in this summary, you say the advantage of a facade consultancy or engineering for the building owner or architect is that the technical advice given is not attached to any commercial interests. The engineers involved are expected to have detailed technical knowledge of the construction industry and thereby to act as a trusted intermediary between the architect or building owner and the industry. Now, can you just help us as to what it is that protects a facade engineer from being linked to commercial interests, as you've indicated there?
Yes, what I mean is, if you're talking about getting advice from a manufacturer, for example, it's in the manufacturer's interest to sell their products. So, of course, it's hard to say that they won't be biased in their opinion because they've got a direct commercial interest in selling product A or product B.
Yes.
Whereas in the case of a facade engineer who presumably is not a shareholder in a manufacturing company, then the advice given is based on purely technical considerations and they don't stand to gain or make profit from their advice.
Yes. What about advice given at an early stage by a specialist cladding contractor? Would you have reasonably expected that to be attached to commercial interests, or would you expect that to be independent in the same way that the facade engineer would be?
They're in a halfway stage probably between the manufacturer and the consultant, but inevitably a contractor is in a position where they have to build something for a certain sum of money, and it's in their interests to use products which satisfy the specification, but not pay over the odds for those products so that they maximise their return.
Yes.
So yes, there are commercial interests.
Yes. So if at the pre-novation stage, Studio E or anyone else, including the TMO, went only to cladding contractors or manufacturers, there's a danger that the advice that you're getting is going to be influenced by those commercial interests.
Yes.
Yes. Now, just moving on to think about the post-novation stage. So imagine we're in a design and build context. A design and build contractor is appointed, as occurred on Grenfell Tower. At that stage, and once the principal contractor is on board, would you expect that principal contractor itself to be, first of all, aware of the existence of facade consultants as a potential resource?
Yes.
Would you have expected a design and build contractor on a project like Grenfell Tower to have at least considered the appointment of a facade engineer or consultant?
Yes.
What about a specialist cladding contractor themselves, so those akin to Harley Facades? Are there ever circumstances in which they may consider appointing a facade consultant directly for advice?
I can't see it being necessary in this context, no. The sort of situation would be where the specialist contractor did not have their own design office, and typically they might hire an outside engineer to do the detailed structural design, for example, or sometimes an outside drafting company to do the detailed drawings and so on. But as I understand it, on this particular project, that wasn't needed. They had in-house capability, as I understand. Sorry, they did subcontract it, but that subcontractor had that capability.
Yes. Does the fact that Harley didn't have anyone with a completed qualification in facade engineering, nor anyone formally appointed to the role of technical manager at the time of the Grenfell Tower refurbishment, have any bearing on this question?
I don't think having a technical qualification in facade engineering per se had a bearing on it. And what was the second part of your question?
Yes, nor was there anyone appointed to the role of a technical manager at the time of the Grenfell Tower refurbishment.
I'm not quite sure about what the role of that technical manager would have been.
Yes.
They certainly needed someone who was a technical design person,
Yeah.
who would have been reviewing technical submissions and drawings and preparing information to send to the architect and so on for review.
And would that technical design person need to be able to make an assessment of fire performance and fire safety, as well as structural performance and structural safety?
Yes, that would have been one of the many things they had to consider, yes.
Yes. If we can turn to section 6.3 on page 25 of your report. You're asked the question, you can see in bold and italics, if a facade engineer or consultant was not instructed on a project, who would you expect to undertake that role or perform the duties ordinarily carried out by such a person? And at 6.3.3 at the bottom of that page, you say, if, however, the facade engineer would have been appointed by the main contractor and they were not so appointed, their role would have to be carried out by the main contractor's own design office or by an architect appointed by the main contractor as a sub-consultant. And then you say, if none of these sources of expertise were available, so if we go over the page, if none of these sources of expertise were available, the specialist facade contractor would have to be relied upon to provide the necessary design and technical expertise. So that's your evidence there. Is it your opinion that if a facade engineer was not appointed and such expertise was not available elsewhere, the reasonably competent specialist cladding contractor could be relied upon to have such design and technical expertise in-house?
Yes, if they were reasonably competent.
Yes. So any reasonably competent cladding contractor, in the absence of someone else being appointed, ought to have had the relevant design and technical expertise.
Yes.
Yes.
If I could just add.
Yes.
I have experienced in my own career situations where the main contractor wanted to vet the information being provided by the specialist subcontractor, and therefore wanted to appoint a facade consultant to review the subcontractor's work.
Yes.
That's not that uncommon.
Yes.
I've had a few cases like that. So I think it wouldn't happen if the main contractor was comfortable enough with the technical expertise of the subcontractor that they didn't feel they needed to review it.
Yes.
Then that wouldn't happen. But if they felt that they had some concerns about it, then they would appoint a facade engineer to be a sort of intermediary.
Yeah. That sounds like there ought to have been some assessment by the main contractor of the technical expertise and competence of the cladding subcontractor. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. And can you give us an exact, what's the nature of that assessment? How would you find out that information about whether your cladding subcontractor had the necessary design and technical expertise to mean that you didn't need another resource or another checking exercise to be carried out?
Probably, I would imagine, through a process of interviewing, meeting the MD and the chief technical person, and just getting a sense of what their capabilities were. Yes.
Now, you say on page 22 of your report, if we can go to that, at paragraph 5.2.2, you say, it therefore follows, sorry, if we could just blow that top paragraph up to make it a bit bigger on the screen. It therefore follows that a reasonably competent cladding contractor would be expected to have a person or people in their technical department who had the expertise necessary to deal with the design and technical matters that were likely to arise. Such people would be expected to recognise where there were gaps in their expertise and to know how to go about filling those gaps, either through research or by consulting others with appropriate expertise. Now, would you expect this, take the kind of average UK cladding contractor, a reasonably competent one, would you expect it to be one individual within that organisation with the necessary technical and design expertise, or would you expect there to be a team of people who would all have that expertise?
It really depends how large the contractor is.
Yes.
If it's a small contractor, you might just have one person, and large contractors have several.
Yeah. And can you give us an idea of precisely what experience and qualifications you would expect such a person or such people to have obtained in order to be competent to deal with design and technical matters?
I wouldn't necessarily say they had to have a particular academic qualification. Some people have degrees, other people don't, but they may be perfectly capable of doing the work. It's probably experience is more as important, if not more important.
Yes. So experience of designing facades and dealing with all aspects of the facade design, including fire performance. Yes. Yeah. Just some further questions about the obligations of a design and build subcontractor. If we look at page 26 of your report, paragraph 6.4.2, we see, well, let's start with the question that you're posed there. We can see from the question at 6.4, responsibility for designing the facade, that you're asked the question, how would that person's role relate to the role of the architect? If both were appointed, which of them would normally take primary responsibility for designing the facade? So here you're being asked a question which touches on this the division of responsibility between an architect who may have been appointed at the pre-innovation stage as well, and then a cladding contractor designing the facade. And at 6.4.2, you explain that it may depend on how the contract is written in terms of responsibilities, and you give us some specific examples. I'm not going to read this all out in the context of what the Grenfell contract says, and you say in that paragraph that there was a general obligation on the main contractor which was passed on to Harley in relation to the facade works, and that included the design of the facade. Is it right that it wouldn't be possible to complete a design of a facade without first considering and accepting or rejecting the basic premise of the design that the cladding contractor was inheriting based on the work of the architect at the pre-innovation stage?
Yes. There's an interaction, really. On the one hand, the specialist contractor would take it that the architect had done a reasonable job in producing a design which was technically sound and compliant with regulations. On the other hand, the subcontractor took on that responsibility and therefore had to satisfy themselves that it was technically competent and compliant. So couldn't just rely on the architect having done it,
Yes.
but had to satisfy themselves independently that it did in fact do the job.
Yes, that's very helpful. Now, in your experience, and in circumstances where, and I know you said this is unusual, but in circumstances where product selection had occurred
Yeah.
in the architect's specification, so they've not just done a performance specification, you've actually got some products selected, would you expect a reasonably competent cladding contractor responsible for the design of the facade to have reconsidered that product selection as part of its design obligations and its design work?
Yes, I think it had a duty of care to satisfy itself that the products met the specification and regulations. Yes.
Yes. So you wouldn't just take a product that was in the spec,
Yes.
say, well, it must be compliant, it must be fine, we'll work with that and just move forward to deal with fixings, etc. You would actually ask yourself the question afresh whether that was the right product for this job, yes?
Yes.
Yeah. And can you help us as to how it would work in practice in terms of how much weight would be placed on the design work of an architect? What kind of factors would influence how much weight you would place on that design if you were the design and build subcontractor coming in with design responsibility?
In the sense of weight, in the sense of confidence in that design, you mean?
Yeah, what factors would influence how confident you were in that design and the extent to which you would place any weight on it, if that makes sense?
Yes, I suppose it would have to depend to some extent on the experience and reputation of the architect and what one felt about them. If one had let's say, a small, inexperienced architect, the cladding contractor would probably look at it more closely in practice. Or on the other hand, if you had a big international experienced architect, they might look at it a bit less closely. But to be honest, my feeling is their duty of care is the same in both cases.
Yes, thank you. Let's take the example of cavity barriers for a moment. In circumstances where some work had been done on a cavity barrier scheme and design by the architect, in your view, would the reasonably competent cladding contractor have checked that those cavity barriers were in fact compliant with relevant guidance, including approved document B?
It's interesting. If you go back to the previous page in answering your question.
Yes, page 25 of your report.
Yes. Oh, sorry. No, sorry, we're in a different section. I'm sorry, I thought we were in a different section of the report.
Don't worry. If you can tell us which section you want to be in.
It was when we were talking about the appointment of the cladding contractor and the appointment of the architect post-contract. The cladding contractor's appointment said something quite specific, which was they have detailed design responsibility.
Yes.
I don't recall that being said in the architect's appointment, but it did say in the architect's appointment that they had responsibility for coordinating compliance,
Yes.
I think. Something like that, those words?
So if you go back, I think, to page 26 of your report,
Yes.
you're dealing with 6.4.2.
You're there, yeah.
Is that the bit you wanted?
Yes.
Is it 6.4.3? By contrast, Ryden's
Yes, if you
contract
go
with
down.
Studio E was much more specific and referred.
If you just scroll down a bit. Yes, you see, it refers to coordination of building regulations approvals.
Yes.
That seemed to be Studio E's responsibility,
Yes.
according to their contract. On the other hand, Harlow's responsibility seems to be they remain fully responsible for the design, including relevant compliances. So there's a bit of an overlap there.
Yes.
And it's difficult, you know, I think it's tricky when both an architect and a cladding subcontractor are both appointed to have some design responsibilities. It's a bit tricky to know who's really ultimately responsible. They both are, really.
Yes. Could coordination of building regulations approvals be effectively the coordination and the communication with building control, leaving the cladding subcontractor to be fully responsible for the design?
Yes, it could be read like that, yes.
Well, before you go on, Miss Grange, I would find it helpful to have an answer to the question that Miss Grange actually asked you before that little diversion, which was this, that in a case where some work had been done on cavity barrier scheme and designed by the architect, would the reasonably competent cladding contractor have checked that the cavity barriers were in fact compliant with ADB? In other words, would he regard himself as under an obligation to check the architect's work?
Yes. The answer is yes.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. If the reasonably competent cladding contractor had subcontracted the installation itself of the cavity barriers to another company, would you expect that cladding contractor to themselves to carefully supervise and regularly check the installation to ensure it was compliant?
Yes.
Yes. Now, if we go to page 27 of your report now and 6.6.3, this is where you're discussing the curtains consulting specification that was prepared for Grenfell Tower that we've just discussed. And we can see that this curtains specification expressly states that the system should comply fully with the BR 135 document. I think you see that over the page, if we look one page over. There, at 7.1.3, the system should comply fully with the BRE document. In those circumstances, and assuming for the moment that this curtain specification was incorporated into Harley's subcontract for the cladding work, would you have expected someone within Harley to have read BR 135 in full?
Yes.
Yeah. And the curtain specification to which you refer there also incorporated two further CWCT documents. It's the two CWT documents that we discussed earlier, the older ones, the Standard for Walls with Ventilated Rain Screens from 1998 and the Guide to Good Practice for Facades from 1996. And again, the same question. In those circumstances where you've got express incorporation of particular guidance documents in the subcontract, do you consider that the reasonably competent cladding contractor should have read those documents as well?
Yes.
Yeah. Just briefly, if we turn to that CWCT standard, the standard for walls with ventilated rain screens, first published 1998, at CWCT 5053, page 45. If we look at, in the middle of that page, paragraph 220.4, there's a section, ventilated cavity. It says, the cavity behind the rain screen and in front of the air barrier should not include materials which can significantly promote flame spread within the unseen cavity. In general, this zone may contain a timber, aluminium or other metal vertical framework and an appropriate non-combustible insulation. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And the notes on the right of this section, in slightly smaller typeface, you can see it says on the right, the use of any combustible material for the cladding framework and insulation within the cavity may need to be carefully considered as the building height increases. It is often necessary for the purposes of ventilation to subdivide the building into compartments, etc. And then at 2.20.8 on page 46, we can see under the heading insulation in the cavity, it tells us where it is necessary to provide insulation in the cavity fixed to the outer face of the air barrier for the purposes of thermal insulation and condensation control, then the insulation shall be of a non-combustible type.
Yeah.
And then on the right, it says in certain conditions, insulation with appropriate surface spread of flame characteristics may be considered. However, the use of a separate fire barrier not incorporating the combustible insulation should always be specified. So we've got those excerpts there. And then if we look at the other CWCT document from 1996, which is at CWCT 5055, page 13, this is the Guide to Good Practice for Facades. On page 13, we can see at paragraph 410.1, under thermal insulation, it says thermal insulation shall be inert, durable, rot and vermin proof, and should not be degradable by moisture or water vapour. Attention is drawn to the fire performance of some insulating materials as set out in the relevant standard. So we can see that there was guidance within those CWCT documents about the need for non-combustible or inert insulation. Now, taking those excerpts...
Just to be clear, I mean, inert doesn't mean non-combustible, just to be, so we're not...
No, I understand that. I do understand that.
Yeah.
But taking those excerpts into account, would you agree that if the curtains performance specification was followed, which incorporated express reference to these two documents, it would have led a reasonably competent cladding contractor to select non-combustible or at least limited combustibility insulation?
Yes, however, I'd like to qualify that.
Yes,
which is that, as we discussed earlier, the approved document B would have been considered together with these documents, and I think a cladding contractor probably would have looked at approved document B and said, well, approved document B allows me to do this, so I'll follow that, because it would have had a greater weight.
Yes, I see. Yeah. Yes. Now, fire strategy reports now. I want to ask you some questions about cladding contractors' obligations in relation to fire strategy reports. If we go to page 62 of your report, this is under the heading, relationship between cladding contractor and the fire engineer this time. We can see that you're asked the question, to what extent, this is at little a below that, to what extent was it the practice for fire safety or fire strategy reports prepared by fire engineers to be considered by specialist cladding designers or contractors? And you tell us at 18.1, you say fire safety and fire strategy reports contain much information relevant to their subject matter I would expect a cladding contractor to have read these reports and to take note of any matters which affected their work, particularly with regard to materials and design detailing. And then you go on to say, just pausing there. When you say their fire safety and fire strategy reports contain much information relevant to their subject matter, can you just expand on that for us and explain what information a cladding contractor would typically expect to find in a fire safety strategy report, which would be relevant to their work?
Well, it might contain information about the requirements for cavity barriers, for example. You might say cavity barriers shall be provided at so many centres, or having a capability of so many minutes or something. Information that could be got from the approved document, but the fire strategy report might have set out that information just to make it easier.
Yeah.
It might show where means of escape routes were. Sometimes parts of the facade have to be breakable so that means of escape can be achieved occasionally, or breakable so that fire brigade can get into the building in emergency. What else? There might be situations where parts of the building had to be fire resistant because they were near, for example, a railway line or something. And therefore they had to have a 2-hour fire rating or something like that. So that sort of information.
Yes, thank you. Now, in circumstances where these fire strategy reports or report had not been provided to a cladding contractor, would you expect the reasonably competent cladding contractor to ask whether such fire safety reports existed for a project like Grenfell Tower?
If they weren't provided as part of their contract, I would expect them to ask the question whether they existed if an issue arose that would have been covered by such a report. You know, if there was some question mark about something or other, and I can imagine the contractor asking, well, what does the fire strategy report say?
Yeah.
You know, but in the absence of such a question, I wouldn't imagine they would ask for such a report.
Right. So they're not such important documents or documents that are so routinely provided to cladding contractors that you would expect in the abstract at least the question to be posed, is there a fire strategy report for this building?
No.
No.
The point being is that a cladding contractor would be expected to provide all necessary documentation by the main contractor.
Yes. And if there was no such fire safety strategy available to the cladding contractor at the point in a project when the cladding was being designed, would you expect a question to be raised at that stage? Well, we're at the cladding design stage. Is there a fire strategy report that we need to be taking into account?
Sorry, at the pre-contract stage?
Well, at any point when the cladding is being designed, let's assume it's Harley and they've come in as Ryden's subcontractor.
Yes.
They're going to take Studio E's design work and carry it forward to carry on designing the facade. Would you expect them to ask Ryden whether there was a fire safety strategy for the building?
Well, as I said, it's really the same answer. I wouldn't expect them to ask for it unless there was a specific issue that had arisen which suggested that they needed it.
Yes. At paragraph 18.2 of your report, it's there on the screen. We can see you've been asked the question, if a fire engineer had been appointed, to what extent was it the practice for there to be collaboration between the fire engineer and the cladding designer or contractor? Mm-hmm. And then you answer at 18.2, following on from their reading of the fire strategy or fire safety reports, or related risk assessments, the cladding contractor might have questions and seek clarification on some issues. So that's the evidence you were just giving. You go on, you say, during the course of a contract, I would therefore expect them to raise these questions with the appropriate party. Contractually, this would normally be via the main contractor, but in practice, the cladding contractor might address the architect on this, or even the fire consultant directly, provided that all correspondence is copied to the main contractor. If the cladding contractor were to deal with the fire consultant directly in this way, they would need to have been authorised to do so by the main contractor. In your experience, what kind of questions or clarifications would a cladding contractor typically raise, having reviewed the fire safety strategy reports?
Well, a good one is, because I believe it's come up in evidence in the inquiry, has been what fire rating did the cavity barriers need to have.
Yes.
And I noted that issue went round and round several times before it was resolved. So that's the sort of thing that they might have addressed.
Yes, I see.
Or queried.
If a fire strategy was provided, but it wasn't complete, if it said, for example, that a particular analysis would be confirmed in a later issue of the report, would you expect the reasonably competent cladding contractor to pick up on that and ask whether there was a final version of the fire strategy?
Yes. I would expect any member of the project team to pick up on that.
Yes. Yes. Now, I'm going to ask you some questions now about the BBA certificate for the Rayna Bond 55 ACM panels. Just as a general proposition, to what extent would you expect the reasonably competent cladding contractor to rely on information in a BBA certificate about, say, the fire performance of a particular product?
I would expect them to rely on it to a great extent, because the BBA is considered a reputable body, and their certificates generally to be trusted.
Yes. So if you could just encapsulate for us what was the reputation of the BBA and their certificates within the cladding industry during the relevant period, 2012 to 2017, how would you describe the reputation that BBA certificates had?
It was a good reputation.
Yeah. If we look at page 49 of your report, paragraph 12.1, just want to look at the first 4 lines of that. You're being asked about the understanding by the cladding industry of fire test evidence, and to what extent was it common within the cladding industry to be requesting fire test evidence from manufacturers or suppliers of cladding products. And at 12.1, you say specialist contractors or their cladding designers would normally have referred to the manufacturer's technical literature and or relevant certification for the products they were considering. And you say such certification would have included, for example, BBA or LABC certification. Now, you say that specialist contractors would normally have referred to the manufacturer's technical literature and or relevant certification. If the reasonably competent cladding contractor was aware that a product held certification from the BBA or the LABC, for example, would you expect them to review those certificates as part of its assessment of the product?
Yes, I think I've said elsewhere, in general, I would expect the contractor as a whole to accept that certification, but I would expect their technical department to look at it a little bit more closely.
Yes. Yes. So, just
to examine the details of the certificate, that's what I mean.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Just staying with this paragraph and carrying on, picking it up in the 4th line, you say these, so this is 12.1, these certificates in turn may have given relevant BS, EN or fire test references and strictly the cladding contractor or their designers should have looked at this background information. However, in my view, most cladding contractor designers would have regarded the BBA or LABC as an authority, and they would have been content to rely on the certificates without going back to the source data, provided, of course, that they, the contractors, were mindful of any caveats included in the certification. Now, in section 13 of your report, we don't need to turn to it, you've identified a number of important features concerning the BBA certificate from 2008 for the Rayna bond panels. I'm just going to summarise some of the features you've identified. For example, you've identified that the first page of the certificate gives the impression that the product has Class 0 without qualification. That's one of the points you've made. But you go on to explain that section 6 of the certificate on fire performance contains much technical detail, which requires significant analysis in order to obtain a clear understanding of what exactly the fire properties are of the product. Is that fair? A fair
Yes.
summary? Yes. And you
By the way,
have
I've still got section 12 up on the screen here.
Yes, sorry.
Okay.
We can just turn to section 13. So I think it's the next page or the page after. If we go to page 50. Yes, here it is. And you've also said that it was not clear exactly what was covered by the certificate and whether that included the whole cassette system or the subframe supporting it. And you have said that at the very least, that ambiguity about whether the certificate covered the cassette panels should have led a cladding contractor to raise that question with Arconic, yes?
Yes.
Yes. Now, in those circumstances, and particularly given what you've said about the important limitations contained in section 6 of the certificate, would it have been necessary, do you think, to consider the underlying source tests and test data in order for someone to fully understand the fire performance of the product and in order to understand the certificate and its limitations?
Yes, I think the question should have been asked. I'm not saying that the cladding contractors should themselves have necessarily interrogated the test data, but at least they should have had a dialogue with the manufacturer to find out what information, for what background information there was to the certificate.
Yes, yes, so that the true nature of the product's fire performance could be ascertained.
Yes.
Yes. Now, if we go now to paragraph 13.3 of your report at page 50, I think this is where you're dealing with the point about who should have read which bits of the certificate. And you say, in my opinion, most members of a cladding contractor's staff would have been content to see that a product was covered by a BBA certificate and would probably not have read the details on that certificate. But then you go on. However, those members of the cladding contractor's staff with technical or design responsibility would be expected to be more familiar with the details of the certificate, and I would expect them to have read it in greater detail. Now, just to be absolutely clear, is it your opinion that the reasonably competent cladding contractor would ensure that somebody with technical or design responsibility had read any relevant BBA certificate in detail to ensure that the product was appropriate for its intended use on a project?
Yes.
And that would involve reading the whole of the certificate in its entirety, not just any summary on the front, yes?
Yes.
And then you go on to say at 13.5 on that same page, you say, in my opinion, it's you're talking about the certificate is misleadingly drafted in that it gives the impression that the product has a Class 0 rating without qualification. However, on turning to section 6, it's apparent that this contains vital information about the details and limitation of the fire testing carried out. And you say, I consider that a reasonably competent cladding contractor should have read section 6 in full. Had they done so, they would have been alerted to the fact that the BBA certificate was very specific in its scope. Now, in your opinion, would it be incumbent upon those members of staff with technical or design responsibility to alert other employees within the cladding contractor's staff about the certificate's limited scope, if they had appreciated that.
Yes.
Would it also be incumbent upon the reasonably competent cladding contractor to alert other third parties to the limitations of the certificate if it had been read properly?
Yes.
For example, for example, the main contractor on the project,
Yes.
the architect,
Yes.
the fire engineer.
Well, they would, I would imagine not so much alerting the fire engineer, but they might have been brought into the discussion of what to do about it.
Yes.
Yes.
What about the building control officers responsible for approving the project?
Yes, although one would have thought that they'd resolve it as a team in-house first
Yes.
before going to the building control.
Yes.
Yeah.
But let's assume they haven't resolved it in-house, but then someone realises the certificate has these limitations. In those circumstances, would you expect it to have been raised with building control and the question asked what building control thought about those limitations?
Yes.
Well, can I start? Would you expect the cladding contractor to do that himself, or would you expect him to alert
No, that's right.
another member of the team who could be expected to approach building control?
Yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, I'm not talking about the logistics of this so much. I think the way this sort of thing would have happened is that a discussion would take place between the specialist contractor and the main contractor and the architect, and they'd come to a conclusion about what to do, and they'd decide which of them should approach who, and that's how it would go. And it wouldn't necessarily be the specialist doing that approach. You're right. I mean, it would probably be, if it's building control, it would probably be the architect.
And then there could be an interesting question if the line that the main contractor wanted to take was not one which the subcontractor was entirely happy with.
Exactly. So, yes, that's why they'd have to agree as a team first before they made any approach to building control.
Yes, all right. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Now, sticking with the BBA certificate, if we go to page 51, just one page on within section 13 to 13.8, one of the specific points you've picked up on is that clause 6.4 of the certificate states that these performances may not be achieved by other colours of the product, and goes on to say that if another paint finish is used, the designations for a particular colour should be confirmed by test or assessment in accordance with approved document B, Appendix A, Clause 1. You say this clause broadly requires further testing and assessment by suitably qualified specialists. Now, is that an example of the kind of detail that you would have expected members of staff with technical or design responsibility within the cladding contractor to pick up on?
Yes, I would imagine they would have gone back to the manufacturer and said, well, what does this mean? And we're planning to use colour X and the certificate is for colour Y. What are the implications?
Yes.
You know.
Yes. So, and those are the steps you think a reasonably competent cladding contractor should have taken once they realised and appreciated that the colour panel they were proposing was not covered by the certificate?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's, by the way, it's not only about colour, it's about the paint type as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And you say at paragraph 13.9 of your report, on that same page, you say, I also note that the mention in section 6.2 of the BBA certificate of the existence of the FR cord ACM panels, which appears to achieve national class 0 as required, would at the very least have informed a cladding contractor that an FR rated version of the product was available. Now, would you agree that the reasonably competent cladding contractor during the relevant period should have been aware in any event that many major manufacturers, for example, Alucobond, were manufacturing FR variants as at 2013-2014? Should they have known that in any event, regardless of what was said in this specific BBA certificate?
I don't know. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. did there come a time when FR metal composite panels were widely known to be available in the UK market?
So I missed the first part of that.
Yeah, did there come a point when
When they were-
FR metal composite panels were widely known to be available in the UK market?
I can't give you a date for that, I'm afraid.
Are you aware that in the middle of 2013, some cladding panel manufacturers stopped promoting ACM panels with an unmodified polyethylene core and/or more actively promoted their ACM panels with a fire-resistant core in response to safety concerns generated by the UAE cladding fires?
Yes.
Given the functional requirement in B41 and the fact that the PE panel did not, on a close reading of the BBA certificate, in fact achieve National Class Nord, do you agree that the reasonably competent cladding contractor should have been considering an FR panel as a minimum level of fire performance in any event?
I'm just trying. There seem to be two questions there.
Yes, I'm sorry.
I think.
Yeah. Let me make it more simple. So let's take the functional requirement. Given the functional requirement, do you agree that the reasonably competent cladding contractor should have been considering an FR panel as a minimum level of fire performance in any event?
In answer to your question, as far as I understand it, the BBA certificate showed that within certain constraints, the FR panel achieved Class 0.
Yes.
Although for particular colours, and it wasn't a cassette, but that's another.
Yes.
And in that sense, to achieve Class 0, the only thing that the BBA certificate covered was to use an FR rated core. Yes.
Yes, I understand that.
That's the only thing that complied with Class 0 as directly tested, yes.
Yes. Would you agree that even if it was proposed that an FR cladding panel might be used, any reasonably competent cladding contractor would still need to verify the actual fire performance of any FR product?
Yes.
Now, at paragraph 310 of your report there, you say, furthermore, I note that clause 1.1 of the certificate states that the panels are available either plain-edged riveted system or flanged cassette system to suit architectural requirements. And then figure 1 shows illustrations of both systems, and we've looked at that many times, where you can see the rivet system and the cassette system. In your view, would a reasonably competent cladding contractor expect any significant difference in fire performance between these two systems, i.e. cassette versus rivet? Would they expect that to be highlighted in a certificate that refers to both type of system?
I'm not sure. Would they expect it? Would I expect it?
Would a reasonably competent cladding contractor expect that any significant difference in fire performance between the two systems would be highlighted in the certificate?
Yes, I think that would be reasonable for them to expect that.
Yeah. Now, if we turn to section 16 of your report on page 57. Now, in this section of your report, you are explaining the factors which might lead to the use of ACM panels with a PE core. And you tell us in 16.3 that ACM panels are relatively stiff panels and that stiffness was an important property to enable it to resist wind pressure and damage impacts. And you also tell us that the stiffness creates a flatter panel which is architecturally more acceptable. And you go on to tell us at 16.4 that ACPs contain roughly 1/3 the aluminium of aluminium panels of the same stiffness, and that as aluminium is relatively more expensive than the PE core, an ACP will therefore be relatively cheaper than a panel of the same stiffness just using aluminium. And then in the next paragraph, 16.5, you say, also, because PE has lower density than aluminium, and ACP is also lighter in weight, having about 2/3 the weight of an aluminium panel of the same stiffness. This makes the panel easier for operatives to handle on site, which is a useful property, particularly when working at height. Now, so those are some of the reasons that you've explained why these aluminium composite panels may be selected. In addition to those reasons, and in a competitive environment, is another reason that ACM with a PE core might be used, is that it's cheaper than any other composite cladding. For example, it's usually cheaper than a zinc composite product. Is that correct?
I would imagine, yes.
Yeah. And it's usually cheaper than any FR cored product. Yes?
I believe so.
Yeah. Now, in the next paragraph, 16.6, you then give technical factors which would lead to the ACP not being selected for use. And the first point you've made there is, 1, the PE core is combustible. And then 2, you've said the panels require careful detailing to avoid unsightly edges being visible. And then 3, the method of forming tight corners requires milling the inner aluminium sheet along the fold lines, thus exposing the combustible core. And then 4, some architects have a preference for materials which are homogeneous and are not keen to consider composite materials. Now, just going back to that first point, if we go back a page to the technical reasons why you might not select the aluminium composite panels. And number 1, you've got the PE core is combustible. Can you help us here? And it might sound like a very simple point, but would you expect the reasonably competent cladding contractor to understand that PE was a thermoplastic and therefore would be combustible?
I'm not sure that they would understand it from the point of view of chemistry, as you've expressed. I think the understanding would have come from the fact that there were some known fires using this material, which apparently, according to the press at least, was started off by people's cigarettes being discarded.
Right.
I don't know if that's true or not, but
Yeah.
Clearly the material was quite easily ignited.
Yeah. So that much should have been understood, that it was easily ignited and combustible. Yes. Should the potential dangers of exposing the combustible core along the fold lines have been foreseen, in your opinion, by the reasonably competent cladding contractor?
No, I don't think so, in the sense that, I mean, it may be that a fire engineer might say that's a big problem and there are certain characteristics, but I don't think a cladding contractor would have known that.
No. And with the same answer
Well, sorry, sorry to
Yeah, sorry.
Once you're aware, if you are aware, that the material in the centre of the panel is combustible, one might even say highly flammable, it's not a very big leap, is it, to see that the more of it you expose, the greater the risk of either it catching fire, or if it does catch fire, the fire propagating at greater rate.
Yes. I'm thinking, didn't want to get too involved, but when you mill away part of the line inside the panel,
Quite.
and then fold it, the 2 aluminium inside faces come together.
They do they?
They do come together. Therefore, it's a question of what amount of the polyethylene core is exposed. And it may be that a cladding contractor, not being a fire engineer, might have looked at that and said, well, it's not exposing much of the core, so it's probably all right. Or if they were not sure, of course, they could have sought help. But it wasn't, I wouldn't say it was automatically the case. self-evidently the case that it was going to be a problem, it would have needed specialist advice.
Yes, all right, thank you.
Yeah.
What about the exposed edges around the edges of the panel? So with these cassettes, even if we ignore the routing and the folding of the panel, you've got exposed edges all the way around the cassette box, and the same with the riveted panels.
Yeah.
Would you expect the reasonably competent cladding contractor to understand the risks of exposing those edges where you have exposed PE?
Where it's a flat sheet, you mean, and the
Yes.
core is exposed? Yes, I would have thought they'd understand that if the core was combustible, then the exposed core would be a danger. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
But as I say, I don't think that understanding came so much from a consideration of the geometry or the chemistry as the fact that there had been some perfectly clear examples of where it had caught fire.
Yes. Great. Mr. Chairman, I think that's a very good moment for the afternoon
Yes,
break.
so do I. We're going to have a short break now. Sakula, we'll come back at 25 to 4, please.
All right.
And usual request, please don't speak to anyone about your evidence out of the room.
All right.
Thank you. All right, 25 to 4, please. Thank you. Yes, would you ask Mr. Sakula to come back in, please? Right, Mr. Sakula, ready to carry on, I hope?
Yes, thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Grange?
Yes, thank you. Now, staying with the ACM cladding panels, I now want to ask you some more questions about the selection and use of those cladding panels. And if we look at page 60 of your report in section 17, I want to look at paragraph 17.5. So you say there, the industry's understanding of Class Naught has been discussed in section 14 of the present report. I consider that a reasonably competent cladding contractor would have interpreted paragraph 12.6 of ADB and diagram 40 as containing all the requirements for fire performance of the cladding, namely a Class Naught national classification or the related Euronorm EN classification shown on diagram 40. I do not consider that they would have thought that other aspects of fire performance of the cladding needed to apply. So that's your interpretation of paragraph 12.6 and diagram 40 of approved document B. So does it follow from this that it's your opinion that a composite panel with a combustible core could comply with paragraph 12.6 and diagram 40 of approved document B, provided the panel complied with national Class Naught?
Yes.
Yes. Now, we touched on this earlier, and I think you agreed, but wouldn't a reasonably competent cladding contractor have been aware that the Class Naught rating only applied to the external skins and not the core?
Yeah.
What was being tested in national Class Naught was really testing the surface or the outside of the product and not the core.
Yes.
And a reasonably competent cladding contractor would have understood that, yes?
Yes.
And in that regard, can we look again at the CWTC?
Well, before we do, can I just pursue this a little bit further?
Yes.
Because, as I think everyone's agreed, ADB is only a guidance document. How does... what about the actual regulation, B4, that says the exterior wall must not promote the propagation of fire, or must adequately resist, I think, are the actual words used?
Yes.
Doesn't that come into play?
Yes, it does.
I mean, the reason I ask the question is because I find it rather difficult to see that one can say as a cladding contractor, well, so long as it's Class Naught on the outer surface, I don't have to worry about anything else. Is that what you're saying?
I imagine that I've been asked what they would have thought, right? So I imagine that's what they would have thought, because I think that the issue is, I understand what the building regulation says. In the industry, ADB2 would have been considered as the document which sets out an interpretation of how the regulation should be complied with. And the ADB2 was the document that probably that building control officers would have referred to. So that would be considered the source document. But I agree with you about what the regulation actually says. And I in fact bring it up later, that the spirit of the regulation is something different. But what I'm saying is that in terms of what they think they needed to do, what they thought they needed to do, I think they would have looked at ADB2 and felt that that told them what they needed to do.
Without...
Otherwise, why have ADB2?
Well, it's not just that, is it? But if it might be said that if you understand Class Naught correctly, that it is limited in its scope to the outer surface, which leaves open the question of the nature of the material between the two, in this case, the two aluminium skins. And I'm just wondering whether you're saying that, in your view, a competent cladding contractor at the time we're discussing would have felt that he could ignore that.
Well, my view is that ADB2 didn't really acknowledge the existence of composite materials. It was silent on it, and probably should not have been, but it was silent on it, and therefore it didn't really cover it. It was an omission, and so I think people tried to use ADB2 to the best of their ability to cover a case for which it probably wasn't written. You see.
So what does the competent contractor do? Does he just not worry about the substance of what he's planning to put on the building? I mean, it seemed rather inconsistent with things I've read elsewhere in your report, that's all.
Sorry, is your question about should they have considered something in addition to the requirements of ADB2?
Well, I suppose my question is, should a competent contractor at the time have asked himself about the nature of the core of the ACM panels, not just their surface, and as a result have thought about the dangers inherent in using that material on certainly a building of this kind?
Yes, I think they should have thought about it, and then they would have thought, well, I'm required to satisfy Class 0, and what do I need to do to satisfy it? And they would have subjected their material to it. The problem I have with it is that if one is to consider the core, what test would one apply? It's not set out anywhere. And that's the question that the cladding contractor would have raised.
Well, the test might be a common sense test, particularly in the light of the fires in the Middle East.
So is that a question?
Yes.
Well, I formulate it in a different way, if you like. I mean,
Mr. Chairman, if it helps, I'm going to come to the very bit of Mr. Sakula's report that deals with this particular question in just a moment.
all right, well,
And
perhaps I'd better let you take your
I wonder whether it might help Mr. Sakula to be reminded of what he's got in his written report, and then
All right.
we ask supplemental questions.
Well, as usual, Ms. Sakula, it's better that instead of jumping in and asking questions, I let Ms. Grange come to it in her own time.
No.
So we'll let her do that.
No.
Yes, Ms. Grange, on you go.
Yes. So just to recap, you've given your interpretation just purely looking at 12.6 and diagram 40. But you've also acknowledged that a reasonably competent cladding contractor would have been aware that the Class 0 rating was testing mainly the exterior of the panels. Can I just look at a couple of passages in the CWCT standards? If we look at the CWT standard for walls with ventilated rain screens, at CWCT 5053, page 45. If we go to 220.3 at the top, it states there under the rain screen cladding, the outer skin, sorry, if we could just blow it up. The outer skin of a wall of rain screen construction shall have a surface spread of flame of Class 0 rating on both faces in accordance with the building regulations. The two faces are the external panel surface and the internal panel surface. So that's telling you about the Class 0 for the external. And then on page 46, 220.6, under the heading Composite Materials, It says, when one of the rain screen cladding elements is a composite of two or more materials, mechanically jointed, bonded or fused together, the individual elements, including adhesive, must demonstrate the appropriate fire performance. Similarly, it must be demonstrated that the composite will remain reasonably whole and not become prematurely separated from the building or framework. So we've got those passages in that standard. And then if we look at the CWCT standard for systemised building envelopes, the main CWCT standard from 2008.
I'd like to come back to 226, though, after you've done this, if you don't mind.
Well, why don't we deal with it now? Do you want to make a comment on that section?
Yes, and that's well, two comments. I mean, I'm sorry, because you haven't actually answered the question, so
no,
maybe
go on.
it's a bit unfair.
But say what you were going to say about your interpretation of this.
But 226, I've read this, and what I find, I have a couple of difficulties with this, is it says the adhesive must, individual elements must demonstrate the appropriate fire performance. I'm not quite sure what the appropriate fire performance means.
Yes.
In that context, what is the appropriate fire performance is not specified.
Yes.
The second point is that it says that demonstrated that the composite must remain reasonably whole and not become prematurely separated from the building or framework. If one reads BS 476 Part 7, which is the spread of flame test, it actually similarly says that any mechanical delamination or disintegration should be recorded, but it makes a point of saying that this sort of disintegration does not affect the fire classification. It specifically says that.
Yes.
So it distinguishes between mechanical disintegration of a composite and the fire classification. So that's why I find this a little bit unclear.
Yes, I understand.
Okay.
Yes. If we look at that CWCT standard for systemised building envelopes, at CWCT 5046, page 13, here we see at 6.4.21, we've got something on surface spread of flame and external surface spread of flame. Mm-hmm. It says the external surface of the envelope shall satisfy the requirements for Class 0 when tested in accordance with BS 476 Part 6 and 7, National Class, or Class B in accordance with the European Class. And then it says, for rain screen panels, this requirement applies to both the visible external surface of the panel and the surface of the panel facing the cavity. So again, it's talking about the two surfaces. Yeah. And then at 6.6.3 on page 16, it talks about composite components. And it says, when one of the cladding elements is a composite of two or more materials, mechanically jointed, bonded or fused together, the elements as a whole must demonstrate the appropriate fire performance. So that's the same wording. And your point there is, well, what is the appropriate fire performance?
Yeah.
Similarly, it must be demonstrated that the composite will remain reasonably whole and not become prematurely separated from the building or framework. Now, I think the point here is that even if it's not telling you what the appropriate fire performance is, if you read these standards, isn't it getting you to think about the fire performance of each component of your composite panel? Isn't it at least getting you to ask that question or inviting you to ask that question? Would you agree?
Yes.
And going back to paragraph 12.6 and diagram 40, if we go back to page 59 of your report, paragraph 17.4, you say there, clause 12.6 of ADB requires that the external surfaces of walls should meet the provisions of diagram 40. Diagram 40 shows that surfaces on buildings should meet class 0 for floors above 18 metres. I am aware that there are differing views on how external surfaces is interpreted. In this context, my opinion is that a reasonably competent practitioner in the cladding industry would have, and it goes on, an everyday interpretation of this and would consider that a panel that met Class 0 when tested would satisfy this clause. I do not consider that they would have considered this to apply separately to the core of an ACP. So that's how you read just 12.6 and diagram 40 taken on its own. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. And can you just explain what you are aware of in terms of the differing views on how external surfaces is interpreted? You say you're aware that there are different views on how the phrase external surfaces is to be interpreted. Okay. Can you just explain how you became aware of that? Was that something pre-Grenfell or post-Grenfell?
Post-Grenfell.
Yeah.
I can't remember whether it's in Mr. Hyatt's report, but I know it's in Dr. Lane's report, a view on this subject.
Right, yes. And you say at the end of that paragraph, I do not consider that they would have considered this to apply separately to the core of an ACP. Can you just be clear what exactly you mean by that? When you say this to apply, what are you referring to? Do you mean there wasn't a separate Class 0 or Euro class requirement for the core of the panel?
Sorry, I need to look at the beginning of that paragraph.
Yes, sorry, if we go back to 17.4 on the bottom of page 59. Go back again then. Yes, they in that case refers to the contractor. Yes.
Would have considered this to apply separately. Yes.
And when you're talking about this to apply...
Sorry.
In the very last sentence you say, I do not consider that they, i.e. the reasonably competent contractor, would have considered this to apply separately to the core of an ACP. Do you mean the fire performance
standards? The requirement to meet... well, what I mean is, my understanding is that the Class 0 test would have had to be applied, the testing to reach Class 0 would have had to be applied to both the internal and external faces of the panel, but there was no test specified for the core of the panel.
Yes.
So I couldn't see how you could apply a Class 0 test or any kind of surface spread of flame test to the core of the panel.
Yes. Now, just moving on to 12.7 of ADB, which is the next provision, which we find, I just want to read that. If we bring this up within ADB, it's CLG 50224 at page 97. CLG 50224 at page 97. Sorry, I think it's actually at 96. Go back one page. There we have 12.7 insulation materials products, and it says in a building with a story 18 metres or more above ground level, any insulation product, filler material, not including gaskets, sealants and similar, etc., used in the external wall construction should be of limited combustibility, and then see Appendix A. And if we look at what you say about this in your report at page 47, at paragraphs 11.5 and 11.6, you say this, you say, I consider that a cladding contractor would have considered paragraph 12.7 to refer to insulation used as part of the external facade system. The term filler material in clause 12.7 is, however, unclear. I would consider that it was intended to refer to gap fillers, such as expanding foam fillers. I do not think it was intended to refer to the core of an ACM panel, which I have never heard referred to as filler. I also think that a reasonably competent cladding contractor or product manufacturer would have had a similar view. So, and can you just help us as to when you formed the view that the term filler was unclear? When did you reach that view? Was it when looking at the inquiry's questions?
Yes, although I probably looked at it, certainly when I looked at the inquiry's questions, but I probably also looked at it previously in recent years. And I've always found it a little bit odd, that phrase.
Yes. And is your interpretation of the term filler material in that clause, is that solely based on the wording and the language used in paragraph 12.7 of approved document B, or have you been influenced by anything else in terms of your view of that particular wording?
Well, could I answer that question slightly in a roundabout way?
Of course.
Which is, I'm aware of the fact that I think the Ministry of Local Government issued some post-Grenfell information which seemed to imply that filler was included the core of an ACM panel,
Yes.
I believe, which I thought, frankly, I don't agree with that. I think that was, I don't know, I just think that was a bit of a stretch, a linguistic stretch, really, since clause 12.7 was about insulation,
Yes.
not about cladding. As far as I believe there may have been a conference in Oxford 2019 where there was a presentation given, and I probably refer to that, which also discussed this topic. But that view was all went towards informing my view.
Yes. Yes.
Can I just, sorry to keep interjecting.
No, please do.
Of course, it's very interesting for us to know how you would interpret this, but I think what we would really benefit from is your evidence, if you're able to give any, about how this provision was widely understood in the cladding industry at the time. Are you able to help on that?
Yes, I think so. I sincerely believe that the term filler material in the context of clause 12.7 would have been interpreted as insulation or things acting as insulation. And I've mentioned foam fillers, for example, sprayed out of a can.
Yeah, but not to extend to the core of a composite panel. Right, thank you very much.
Yes. So to encapsulate your view is that clause 12.6 is silent about the fire performance of the ACM core, and your view is that paragraph 12.7 doesn't help on that question either, because that's not dealing with the core of an ACM panel. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. Now, if we then go to page 59 of your report and look at section 17, this is headed Sufficiency of Class 0 in Selecting Rayna ACM PE Panels, but you were asked a key question here, and I'm just going to read the question. So the inquiry would be grateful if you would answer the following question as part of your discussion of diagram 40 in ADB. At the time the cladding was being selected for the Grenfell Tower project, was Class 0 enough to select Rayna ACM PE panels, assuming there was a BBA certificate which clearly confirmed they were Class 0? Now, we know your evidence is there wasn't a BBA certificate that clearly confirmed that. But leaving that aside, was Class 0 enough? And then you're asked, was it enough given, one, that what a reasonably competent cladding contractor should have understood Class 0 to relate to? Two, given what is said in paragraphs 12.5 to 12.9 of ADB, including the warning in 12.5, and what is said and shown in 12.6 in diagram 40. Three, given what was said in other industry guidance, and we've looked at some of that. And four, given what should have been known about PE and its properties and its role in international cladding fires. So it's really asking you, aside from what you see in ADB, given other factors, to what extent was Class 0 enough? And I just want to be clear what you've said in writing about that. If we go to paragraph 17.5, sorry, on page 60 and pick it up there, you say, you've told us in that paragraph, and we've just looked at it, what a reasonably competent cladding contractor would have interpreted paragraph 12.6 of ADB and diagram 40 to mean. And then at 17.6, you've said, relevant other industry guidance during the period in question has been discussed in section 10 of the present report. Of these documents, the most relevant will be BCA Technical Guidance Note 18, published in June 2014, and Issue 1 in June 2015. And then it's 17.7. It is of note that both versions of Technical Guidance Note 18 give a broader interpretation of the applicability of limited combustibility materials than that stated in ADB 2. While limited combustibility is stated in paragraph 12.7 of ADB 2 to apply only to insulation materials, Technical Guidance Note 18 states that the term applies for all elements of the cladding system if the linear route to compliance is being followed. This would have precluded the use of ACPs for cladding buildings with a floor higher than 18 metres above ground level, unless a successful fire test or desktop study were carried out. And then you go on, TGN 18, Technical Guidance Note 18, provided guidance to building control officers on others and how the requirements of ADB should be interpreted. At the very least, you would expect a building control officer to be aware of its contents. And then, if we could go over the page, you say this. Sorry, can I go back a page? I don't want to miss out. I think I might have missed the bottom of that page. Yes. Sorry, picking up at 17.9, you say it is clear that there was a mismatch between what was stated in ADB and what was stated in Technical Guidance Note 18. Both of these documents act as guidance, and in the end, the building regulations themselves carry the greatest weight. 17.10, with reference to earlier clauses 8.1.1 and 9.4 of the present report, I consider that a reasonably competent cladding contractor or manufacturer would have been aware of the combustibility of PE called ACPs, particularly after the UAE fires. However, in my opinion, they would nevertheless have deferred to the guidance given in ADB. Therefore, while ADB Section 12 remained unchanged and was silent about the use of ACPs, a cladding contractor would have interpreted this, that the use of ACPs was still allowed. And then you go on over the next page. I note, however, that ADB is not itself the building regulations, and that the 2010 Building Regulation B4 itself states the external walls of the building shall adequately resist the spread of fire over the walls. And then the final paragraph, 17.12. Therefore, I consider that the use of PE called ACP for cladding a building with a floor higher than 18 metres above ground was unwise, given the known combustibility. In such circumstances, I consider that failure to consider adequately the combustibility of the materials would fall below the standard expected of a reasonably competent practitioner in the cladding industry. This would apply even more so to a situation where such materials were being proposed as a cost-saving measure, where it would be essential to verify whether the cheaper product would perform adequately by comparison with the product for which it was being submitted. Now, focusing on that last paragraph for a moment, where you say that the use of PE called ACM for use on a building above 18 metres was unwise, and that the failure to consider adequately the combustibility of the materials would fall below the standard expected of a reasonably competent practitioner in the cladding industry. Can you help us? What, in your opinion, would constitute adequate consideration of the combustibility of the panels, in your view?
That was a very long question.
Yes. So, I mean,
but
you said that if you failed to consider adequately the combustibility of the materials, that would fall below the relevant standard.
Yes.
What would adequate consideration look like? Can you help us with that?
Yes. I think my view is that I just don't think it was sensible to use these kind of ACM on a tall building, and I think what they should have done is thought, well, let's look in more detail at fire retardant core variant of the ACMs, if we're going to use ACMs.
Yes. So I think what you're saying, and to go back to the chairman's question just a few minutes ago, is that regardless of what we see in ADB and the fact that that's silent and perhaps on one view allows you to use those panels, a common sense, sensible approach would be not to use those panels, given everything else that was known at this time, including their role in those international cladding fires. Is that your evidence?
Yes.
Yes. So can we be clear, therefore, that a reasonably competent cladding contractor should have carefully considered whether ACM PE cladding panels were suitable for use on a high-rise residential building, given the combustibility of such panels and their propensity to propagate the spread of fire?
Yes. And I would add to that, it not only the cladding contractor's responsibility, this issue, it's all parties involved.
Yes, so the architect, the main contractor.
The building control officer.
Yes.
The manufacturer.
And do you agree, therefore, that a reasonably competent cladding contractor should have ensured that other construction professionals involved in the project were aware or were made aware of the combustibility of PE core ACM panels and the hazards of using such panels?
Sorry, your question is, were they made aware?
No, should a reasonably competent cladding contractor have made other construction professionals aware of those hazards? So not only that they appreciated them, but should they have then made others aware of those hazards?
Yes.
And again, would that include telling the main contractor, the architect, the building control officer?
Yes, but I'm not only talking about who they should have told. What I was implying, I understand your question, but
Yeah.
it's also, I would say it wasn't only the cladding contractor's responsibility to do this. There were many people involved.
Yes, I understand. Do you agree that it would be especially important for a cladding contractor to make other construction professionals aware of the combustibility and hazards of PE core ACM panels if the cladding contractor was itself proposing that such panels be specified and used on the project?
I'm sorry, I need to hear, could you repeat that question?
On the assumption that it's the cladding contractor that is actually proposing the use of ACM PE panels,
Yes.
would you agree that it was particularly important that that cladding contractor informed others of the hazards of using those panels?
Yes, because it was they who were proposing it as a cost-saving alternative. Yes.
Yes. And do you agree that any reasonably competent cladding contractor carrying out such an overcladding project should have ensured that the building control officers responsible for approving the construction works knew of the nature and make of the panels used, so as to be in a position to satisfy themselves about the suitability of those panels?
That who should be... I got the last part of the question, but...
Should the cladding contractor have been responsible for making sure that the building control officers were aware of the nature and the make of the panels?
Yes, I think so. Yes, but as we were talking about earlier, I understood that it was the architect's responsibility to coordinate building control approvals. So it wasn't. They had responsibility too to do that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Taking into account what was known about the risks associated with PE core ACM, do you think that a reasonably competent cladding contractor ought to have sought confirmation or verification about the use of such panels from a suitably qualified professional such as a facade consultant or facade engineer?
Yes, except I would also say that they there were parties involved in the team who could have provided similar advice. For example, there was a fire consultant, although their appointment was a little bit ambiguous.
Yes.
By that point, but there was a fire consultant on the project who they could have asked. It wasn't only a facade engineer, or they could have raised it further and more forcefully with the main contractor or the architect.
Yes. Do you agree that where the specification or contract for a cladding project expressly required compliance with fire performance with a standard that went beyond the requirements of ADB, any reasonably competent cladding contractor would comply with those additional or more strenuous requirements?
It's a difficult one because it comes back to this question of the hierarchy and which requirements carry more weight.
Well, let me give you a specific example. If we look at the CWCT standard for systemised building envelopes, the main CWCT standard, and if we can go to that at CWCT 5046 at page 11, at 6.2, we can see fourth paragraph down under general, we can see it says the building envelope shall not be composed of materials which readily support combustion, add significantly to the fire load and or give off toxic fumes. Now, focusing on the first parts of that sentence, just assume that that CWCT standard is part of the contractual requirements.
Yeah. Then in that case...
Do you think that in those circumstances, this effectively should have overridden anything that was contained in ADB and meant that you didn't use ACM PE materials?
It does read like that, and it does appear to override.
Yes.
Yes.
Because can we agree that as demonstrated by the UAE cladding fires, it was apparent to the cladding industry that PE called ACM cladding panels did readily support combustion and would add significantly to the fire load in any fire involving a cladding facade constructed of such panels?
Yes.
Yeah. So, again, just to be clear, can we agree that any reasonably competent cladding contractor carrying out a project which required compliance with this particular standard would have appreciated that PE called ACM should not be specified or used on that project?
Yes.
And in addition to reaching that conclusion, sorry, let me start again. Would reading that part of the CWCT standard have led the reasonably competent cladding contractor to instead use FR called panels to ensure that it didn't contribute to the fire load?
Yes. Could I just make an observation? It's interesting because this statement made seems to imply all building envelopes, regardless of the height of the building. So even if you had a single-storey building, this would apply.
Yes.
Which seems ever so slightly onerous, but
right.
Because we are talking about a tall building here, and ADB2 would suggest that different considerations apply, but this seems to apply for any height of building, including a garden shed.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
There we are.
Now, you talked in your report, and we read it a moment ago, about this mismatch between CWCT Technical Note 90, Technical Note 17, and ADB, and you also refer, if we go to page 43 of your report now, paragraph 10.49. You also refer to a later CWCT note from April 2017, which updated, sorry, it's Technical Note 73, not 17, And that was technical note 98, which, as you've explained there, was even more specific than technical note 73 in its statements about combustibility. And you've set out there the relevant clause, which includes the phrase, or the last sentence of that, therefore, where a building has a story 18 metres or more above ground level, all significant materials should be of limited combustibility. So you've made the point that that was even clearer, that there was this mismatch between ADB and this technical note. So just to be clear, there was also a mismatch between the CWCT technical note 98 and ADB, wasn't there?
Correct.
Now, considering your view that the building regulations themselves, i.e. the functional requirements, carry the greatest weight, we saw that in section 17 of your report, do you consider that the reasonably competent cladding contractor, taking into account that functional requirement, taking into account the warnings in industry guidance, including BR 135 and the CWCT, and taking into account the UAE fires, would have considered that PE cord ACM panels complied with the functional requirement B4 or did not comply?
I think they did comply with the functional requirements of B4, but they didn't comply with other industry guidance.
Why did it comply with functional requirement B4, i.e. the requirement to adequately resist the spread of fire over the walls?
Because as I said earlier, I believe that statement in B4, in 12.5, is an introductory statement which is then fleshed out by further detail, and I think that further detail would have been given more weight than the original introductory statement.
But I think there's a difference between what you see in B4, the functional requirement itself, from the building regulations.
Oh, sorry, you're talking about the building regulation, not ADB2.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry, could you ask the question
yes,
again,
Yes, of course. So considering your view that the building regulations carry the greatest weight, that's the functional requirement,
yes,
adequately resist the spread of fire across
yes,
the walls, and given the warnings we've seen in other industry guidance and the UAE fires, would a reasonably competent cladding contractor have considered that PE cord ACM panels complied or did not comply with that functional requirement?
No, I think they should have considered that it did not comply.
Yes. And should the reasonably competent cladding contractor have gone further than just considering the combustibility of ACM panels, and in your view also concluded that ACM PE was unsafe to use on high-rise buildings?
What was unsafe to use?
ACM PE was unsafe to use on high-rise buildings. So in your report, you've said that a reasonably competent cladding contractor would have considered the combustibility of ACM,
yes,
at least thought about it. What I'm suggesting is that, in fact, would a reasonably competent cladding contractor have gone further and concluded that ACM PE was unsafe to use on high-rise buildings?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you help me with this? Are you actually aware, from your own experience or from your involvement in the industry, of situations in which ACM panels with a PE core were rejected because they were thought not to comply with building regulation B4?
No, I'm not aware of any situations like that. And I have to say, I haven't had experience of specifying or using these panels, so I'm not really so much involved in that part of the industry, so I'm not aware of that.
Right, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I've come to the end of my prepared questions. So if we could have the usual break at the end of the day, just to see if there are any other questions, that would be great.
Now, Mr. Sakula, you may know this, but when we get to the end of Council's questions, we have to have a bit of a pause so that she can check whether there's anything been left out. And also, in case those who are as we're taking part remotely, want to suggest further questions to put to you. So we'll break now until 25 to 5, and then we'll see if there are any more questions for you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. Well, 25 to 5 then, please. Would you ask Mr. Sakula to come back in, please? Well, now, Mr. Sakula, we'll find out if there are any more questions for you.
Right.
Yes, Ms. Grange.
Mr. Chairman, no, we have no further questions from Mr. Sakula.
Very good.
So it just comes to the point where we have to thank you immensely for the hard work you've put into this report and all the assistance you've provided us with. So thank you.
And certainly I'd echo that on behalf of all of us on the panel. It's been a long day, and I hope you haven't found it too tiresome, but we found it very interesting and very helpful to hear what you have to tell us. And of course, we have the benefit of your report, for which we are very grateful as well. So thank you very much indeed for making yourself available to help us. And that's all we have for you, at least today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, Ms. Grange.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for today.
Yes, thank
Tomorrow
you.
we have another witness from the TMO, I think.
I think that's right, in Module 3. Yes, thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. 10 o'clock tomorrow then, please.
Thank you.